Welcome to the 21st lecture of the course on sociological perspectives and modernity. Okay. Till now, we have covered the modules on first, thematic preliminaries, secondly, sociological modernism through the works of Marx and Weber, thirdly, structuralist interpretation through the works of Levi-Strauss and Louis Althusser, fourthly, we have covered the Western Marxist reflections on modernity, society as a human creation through the works of Lukács, Gramsci and Turenne. Fifthly, we have discussed thematic preliminaries I said, then sociological modernism secondly, thirdly structuralist interpretation, fourthly Western Marxism, fifthly we have discussed the module on synthesizing modernity and social theory through the works of Wallerstein, Giddens and Habermas, and now we will come to the sixth module on deconstruction of modernity. Okay. And in this module, we are going to discuss especially three important perspectives, okay, which attempt to deconstruct modernity, okay, namely feminism, secondly cultural studies, and thirdly postmodern. Okay. These three are very important so far as deconstructing modernities. When I say deconstruction of modernity, deconstruction is very integral to Derrida's concept of difference. Okay. We have already discussed this. Now, under what circumstances, under what limiting conditions, okay, we want to make sense of the feminist challenge to the linear view of modernity, okay, the singular view of modernity, namely European modernity and so on. Okay. Now, let us see in this lecture and in the coming lecture, in the next lecture, what we are going to discuss. We are going to discuss especially the feminist challenge to the discourse on European modernity. Okay. And in another couple of lectures, we will discuss cultural studies, and then another couple of lectures will be devoted to postmodernist perspectives. Okay. Then we will try to forge a new totality, okay, and so on. Now, let us see how feminists, the scholars drawn from feminist movements, feminist intellectual politics, they contributed to the domain of a critique to modernity or deconstruction of modernity. Okay. Feminism suggests that European modernity, guided by the Industrial Revolution, Enlightenment, critical thinking, reasoning capacity and so on, must be interrogated by different dimensions, by employing different parameters. And feminism poses key challenge to critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Those four central pillars of modernity, namely holism or totality, reflexivity, rationality and social movements. Those four are the guiding principles of critical modernist paradigm in sociology, and how feminists attempt to deconstruct those central themes of the critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Okay. When I say feminism poses key challenge to critical modernist paradigm in sociology, in terms of what? In terms of intellectual politics. Okay. So, when I say, okay, if you look at this intellectual politics, okay, when I say whether it is related to a certain intellectual question which is historically conditioned, that kind of intellectual politics, when you look at, okay, when I say feminism poses key challenge to critical modernism in terms of intellectual politics, the question is whether the two are compatible or opposed, whether feminism on the one hand and intellectual politics on the other, whether there is a compatibility or they are dichotomous, or they constitute dichotomy. They are opposed groups. Do we think that no intellectual politics, okay, does not consider social movement as a part of critical modernist paradigm in sociology? If it does not include social movement as a parameter of critical modernist paradigm in sociology, then feminism moves away from intellectual politics, Marxism also moves away from intellectual politics and so on. Now, if there is a compatibility with feminism and on the one hand and intellectual politics on the other, okay, precisely because both intellectual politics as well as feminism, they always try to include social movements, okay, in today's world. For a long time, intellectual politics did not include social movement as a parameter of critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Okay. Whatever we discuss in academic setup need not have any bearing on social movement. Okay. Feminism posed that question. Marxism poses that. Okay. We will see what are what kind of analogy we can bring about so far as Marxism and feminism are concerned. Okay. That is why feminism on the one hand and intellectual politics on the other, is there a compatibility or are they opposed? Okay. And this points to earlier discussions on encounter between feminism on the one hand and postmodernism on the other. We will also discuss this, okay, in these two lectures on feminist challenge to European modernity. Okay. And when I say that there is there appears to be an encounter between feminism, postmodernism and critical modernist paradigm in sociology, okay, one may say that no, feminism and postmodernism, okay, on the one hand they try to bring about a critique to critical modernism. It does not imply that feminism and postmodernism are same. No, they are different. There is also a close encounter between feminism on the one hand and postmodernism on the other. And in this lecture, what we are going to do, okay, this lecture, in fact, in these two lectures basically assume very basic knowledge about feminist ideas. Okay. Then, if I say that feminism poses key challenge to critical modernism in terms of intellectual politics, Marxism also poses key challenge to critical modernist paradigm in sociology in terms of intellectual politics. Postmodernism also does. Scholars drawn from cultural studies also do the same. Then let us first discuss the analogy between feminism on the one hand and Marxism on the other. Okay. In this sense, okay, now we are going to discuss those four parameters through which we try to, through four lenses through which we try to examine a critical modernist paradigm in sociology. Let us start with social movements, because therein lies the significance of the analogy between Marxism and feminism. Okay. In terms of what they fall apart from intellectual politics. Okay. We will also discuss we will also discuss the analogy between Marxism and postmodernism, feminism and postmodernism and so on. To start with, okay, we are trying to discuss the analogy between Marxism and feminism so far as social movement is, because social movements are very important components so far as critical modernist paradigm in sociology is concerned. Okay. It is very important. When I say there is an analogy between Marxism and feminism, okay, in terms of at least three parameters. One, there must be an interaction between movement intellectuals and academic intellectuals. Okay. I mean the proponents of intellectual politics or the proponents of academic intellectual dominance for a long time, even in 2017, 2018, even today we can say that even in general we do not tend to include social movements as a part of intellectual exchange of ideas. We always refer to the freedom struggle that India had during the colonial period. We also refer back to the October Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Industrial Revolution, French Revolution and so on. Okay. But what we discuss, does it have any bearing on the outside world today? That intellectual politics, that no, we'll just restrict our movement to only these four walls. Okay. We are not bothered whether, because we are academic community, we do not have any role to play so far as politics is concerned. Okay. Marxism, feminism, cultural studies, postmodernism, they all challenge this position. They suggest, okay, both Marxism, all Marxism, feminism, cultural studies, postmodernism, they always suggest that there must be an interaction between academic intellectuals as well as movement intellectuals. Okay. Suppose if I have to give you an example of some people who come under both, who are considered both as movement intellectuals as well as academic intellectuals, maybe Anthony Giddens, Immanuel Wallerstein, okay, Judith Butler. I mean, they are university professors. Michel Foucault, okay, Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and so on. Okay. Even in India, okay, we find many people, at least not many, but at least a few people who come under both, who are considered both movement intellectuals as well as academic intellectuals. Okay. They try to go beyond this narrow distinction between movement intellectuals and academic intellectuals. If there is no interaction between, for Marxism, for feminism, if there is no interaction between movement intellectuals and academic intellectuals, then this gap that will be created, okay, that will not be able to sustain our desire for change. Okay. That is why whatever we discuss here must have some kind of implications for our economic, culture and polity. Okay. There must be an interaction between movement intellectuals and academic intellectuals. Okay. Through what? If I say that there must be an interaction between movement intellectuals and academic intellectuals, then there is an urgent need of recomposition within the academy. This recomposition. When I say there is an urgent need of recomposition within the academy, okay, I mean the academic intellectuals must try to learn from movement intellectuals, I mean the practical experience, the lived experience, okay, and then they must try to incorporate those things within the academic spaces. Okay. That is why when we discuss certain things about, suppose patriarchy, suppose we discuss something about inequality, that is there as, I mean the way we encounter these things, the way we confront with these things in the larger societal setup, they must be included in the academic spaces. Okay. Not simply for discussion, but to ensure social change, economic change, political change, cultural change, okay, ideological change. Okay. And feminism as well as Marxism, they emphasize on the fact that there is an urgent need of recomposition within the academy. Okay. And the third analogy between Marxism and feminism suggests that, I mean, there are certain characteristics from social movements. What are those characteristics? I mean, there must be a concern for agency, human action, not simply human action, but purposive human action, intentional human action. Okay. That agency may be guided by certain ideology. Okay. That human agency must be guided through certain experience, lived experience, reflexive positions that human agency is going to undertake. Okay. This is very important. Okay. Then we have discussed three parameters through which we can bring about an analogy between Marxism and feminism. One, the interaction between, there must be an interaction between movement intellectuals and academic intellectuals. Secondly, there is an urgent need of recomposition within the academy. And thirdly, we must understand certain characteristics from social movements, I mean concern for agency, ideology, experience, lived experience, reflexivity and so on. Okay. These are basic ideas, I mean about Marxism and feminism. Okay. The historical movement of the emergence of second wave feminism and the interaction with the 1968 Great Revolution in France, okay, led by students, we have already discussed this. Okay. And also early 1970s had left important for understanding development, modernity and so on. When I say second wave feminism, there is a difference between first wave feminism and second wave feminism. Please remember one thing, there is a vast literature on first wave feminism, second wave feminism and so on, but there is a basic difference. There is a basic difference between first wave feminism and second wave feminism. Okay. Please remember this, that what is prima facie, what is first wave feminism? in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Okay. I mean, women fought for suffrage, I mean franchise, power to vote, okay, equal wage, working hours in terms of working hours and so on. Okay. I mean, if I have to go back to the first decade of the 20th century, 1908, 1909 and so on, okay, left-wing democratic women, they first started that no, we want equal wage just like men. There was absolute inequality. Okay. Even today there is inequality so far as wage is concerned, even in India, okay, so far as male and female or men and women are concerned. Okay. You can just look at how much the captain of Indian male cricket team receives, what is his salary and what is the salary of the captain of Indian women's cricket team. Okay. I mean, huge difference even by the BCCI and so on, and government also has been ignoring these aspects. Then when left-wing democratic women, they made an attempt for such equal wage patterns, equal suffrage patterns, equal franchise, I mean power to vote. Okay. They just kept it as de facto rights of women. It was not, it did not come under the legal framework. In the second wave feminism, those de facto rights became de jure rights. If I have to say that what do you mean by the transition from first wave feminism to second wave feminism? Now, the transition from first wave feminism to second wave feminism implies that there is a transition from de facto rights to de jure rights. My power to vote, my power to exercise my franchise, I mean universal adult franchise, universal adult suffrage, okay, equal wage and so on, they came under legal scanner, legal purview in the second wave feminism, which was not there in the first wave. Okay. And feminist writers, okay, devote little time to the movement as such, and the feminist theory of social movements therefore is limited. Okay. The way you will find theories on race, class, okay, perhaps theories have, I'm sure people have been working on these issues, but its vast literature is available, okay, and the way scholars of scholars drawn from feminist perspective devote little time to the movement as such, and the feminist theory of social movements is limited. Most interest actually is on recovering history of first wave feminism rather than understanding the contemporary women's movement in sociological terms. Okay. And such dissociation from contemporary women's movements in sociological terms has negatively affected women's movements, not simply in India, but across the continents in the world. Okay. That is why I said historical movement of the emergence of second wave feminism and interaction with 1968 great revolution in France led by students, okay, had left important have significant implications for our understanding of development and modernity, okay, and mostly feminist scholars, okay, they are engaged in recovering the history of first wave feminism rather than understanding the contemporary women's movements in sociological terms. And such dissociation, such disinterest, okay, is shared with other identity politics movements and contrasts with Marxist emphasis on analysis of present movement. Now, it deviates from Marxism. Okay. This such dissociation from contemporary women's movements in sociological terms is shared with other identity politics movement, maybe caste, maybe race, maybe ethnicity and so on, nationality and so on, regionality and so on, religion. Okay. They are all identity based politics, but that, and hence they contrast with Marx's emphasis on the analysis of present movements. Okay. And that is in feminism you will find there is a stronger focus on enemy agency. These are backlash effects in terms of ideology, in terms of patriarchy and so on. Okay. It is also related, I mean feminist writers, they also dwell upon their certain engagement related to political and at times rhetorical strategy of arguing for necessary links between structure and demands, action and reluctance to examine conditions. When feminists try to look at modernity as forging a political strategy of arguing for necessary links between structure and agency, structure and action, okay, the structure may be captured by patriarchy. Patriarchy is also patriarchy itself is a structure. Okay. Then women's interests, I mean they are a part of agency. Women's interests also can become a structure, okay, at times, and the demands, the concerns that patriarchy in fact has sabotaged our economy, culture and polity, and their relationship with what kind of movement that we are going to forge against patriarchal social order. And it is also related to certain level of reluctance to examine the conditions for this. It is also related not to provide any explanation. It is also related to the interests of 1970s Marxism in ideology and structure, but not agency. I mean the works of structuralists we have seen, Althusser himself was a neo-Marxist, and we have examined Althusser under the rubric of structuralist interpretation of modernity, precisely because he is not only a neo-Marxist, but also a structural Marxist. Okay. And the way feminists try to dwell upon these, okay, that structure becomes more important, okay, than human agency. Okay. Now, for Marx, yes, structure is important, no doubt about it, but it is the human agency which is going to ensure social change, to make change possible. For feminists, perhaps for most of the feminist scholars, okay, not all, okay, most of the feminist scholars, okay, they have been trying to dwell upon the structure more in contradistinction with what kind of concerted, organized political action is required to alter such social order, to alter such political order, to alter such patriarchal social order and so on. Okay. This is very important. Okay. Now when we have to go beyond certain things that empirically when we look at this, okay, before getting into empirical discussion, okay, I mean then what we have discussed till now, we have discussed an analogy between Marxism and feminism, okay, and then we have discussed the distinction between first wave feminism and second wave feminism, okay, and the disinterest or the dissociation from contemporary women's movements in sociological terms by to a large extent by feminist writers is shared with other identity politics movements. I mean these feminist movements, they have become a part of identity politics movements, just like caste, race, or that is why whenever we look at identity politics movements, we look at caste, race, gender, ethnicity, nationality and so on, okay, in contradistinction with Marx's reflections on the analysis of present movements in terms of class. You see, class is not an identity politics movement. There it is class becomes class is different. I mean, in this sense, feminists tend to focus more on enemy agency, okay, in terms of backlash effects, ideology, patriarchy, and so on. That is why they put so much importance on structure, okay, ideology and so on, but not agency. Okay. That is why there is again here you will find there is an analogy between feminism on the one hand and Althusser on the other. Even within structural Marxism, structural Marxist trend, okay, Althusser was thinking of not the actual mode of production, but the idea of mode of production. If you can slightly recall, in structuralist interpretation of modernity we have discussed. Okay? That is why it is also feminists also are more interested in the 1970s Marxism in terms of ideology and structure in Althusserian sense, but not agency. Okay? The empirical questions of compatibility, identity movements, okay, are raised, okay, as is the question of the nature of women's or men's identity and so on. It is very important to understand these things, that these empirical questions. Okay. So far as social movements are concerned. Now, when we look at reflexivity and rationality, okay, we will discuss holism in the next lecture. Okay. But in this lecture, we will discuss reflexivity and rationality so far as the feminist challenge to critical modernist paradigm in sociology is concerned. Okay. One is they emphasize more on lived experience. Okay. We are going to discuss E. P. Thompson and Raymond Williams later on when we will discuss cultural studies and so on. Lived experience, I mean what I experience as a human agency. My experience may be different from that of yours. It does not imply that, or my experience may be different from the general societal experience. It does not imply that my experience will be less significant than the social experience, societal experience. My experience is unique to my own case. Okay? Feminists, they always try to look at these aspects, that not all women have the same experience, that those lived experiences must be foregrounded properly. Okay. Secondly, there is a concern to take women's knowledge seriously. Okay. For a long time, even in today's world, there is a general perception not to take women's knowledge seriously. They always get a second hand trade, I mean stepmotherly treatment. It is very important to understand these, that when we look at equality between men and women, we must create a society, create a space where the relationship between women and men will not be located or situated or forged on unequal terms. And this is also a part of my lived experience, that if women's knowledge on certain things, on everything, I mean everything, will not be taken seriously, then the world will not be a livable place, as we have been observing. Okay? The world will be a livable place only when both women and men participate in the decision making process. This is very important. When we look at reflexivity particularly, there is a relationship, I mean it must be related to theoretical and organizational skills developed within women's. Those lived experiences, they also create a space for theory, they also create a space for the emergence of theory, they also create a space for organizational skills developed within women's movements. Okay? The kind of organizational skills which is required in peasant movement, in manufacturing sector workers movements, or banking sector, insurance sector workers movements, that the same organizational skills cannot be copied in the context of women's movements. You see, organizational skills must be very creative. Okay? That is why feminists, they developed a critique to Leninist model of deduced and imposed knowledge. Okay? There you will find that there is a problem here. Okay? I mean problem in the sense, what Lenin did in the Soviet Union, that he tried to specify certain classes who can bring about a social and political revolution in Russia. He looked at industrial workers, he looked at peasantry and so on, who will bring about that revolution. Then for a long time it became a Leninist model, that yes, we can go ahead with social and political revolution only through industrial workers. Even peasantry was reduced, I mean peasantry was removed from that scenario. It was only when Mao Zedong in China, he carried out a revolution through peasantry called cultural revolution. Only then peasantry was also considered of having the power to make social change possible. Okay. And in this case, okay, feminists bring about a critique to such model of deduced and imposed knowledge. Then especially critique of speaking for women. We do not want to speak for or against. What we are trying to speak against patriarchy, against violence, against domestic violence, against violence at the workplace, against sexual assault, and such things are very important. I mean, such lived experiences are very important, and the methodology that we can bank on may be drawn from oral history, life story, biographical methodology, and so on. And there must be here reflexivity and rationality I am going to discuss at a time. I mean, in this section, that there must be a concern to broaden the area of relevant knowledge. What is relevant knowledge? What is science? What is relevant science? There is always, as Weber said, no, emotive social action, affective social action, they are meaningless. I mean, it's meaningless, it's unreflective in nature and so on. For him, it was only instrumental rationality which assumes greater significance. For feminists, no, let us not have such kind of splits. Emotion also produces knowledge, because emotion is also based on my lived experience. Okay? That they refuse to get into such cognitive splits between what is analytic on the one hand and normative on the other, okay, rational and emotional and so on, objective and subjective and so on. Okay. This is very important. What is relevant knowledge, okay, is also a serious question. That is why feminists try to overcome, or feminists refuse to accept such cognitive splits between analytic and normative, rational and emotional and so on. Okay. And then of course, what kind of reflexivity and rationality that we talk about, that legitimation of, for example, sexuality, housework as serious subject. People very often say that, okay, I mean, women will be engaged in cooking and men will do the outdoor work. Okay. Such division of labor is very dangerous for any society. Okay. Such thinking is lethal for any society. When I say cognitive splits between analytic and normative, rational and emotional and so on, cognitive splits are seen as legitimizing or legitimating exclusion of women's experience and concerns. These cognitive splits have been created just to legitimize the way women's experiences, lived experiences, concerns, issues can be excluded. Okay? And hence, critical modernism is seen as colluding in this domination by political economy and instrumental rationality. And feminists here, they try to provide a critique to Marx as well as Weber. Okay? I mean, when I say political economy in terms of Marx and an instrumental rationality, I mean Weber. Okay? Then there is a political shift from instrumentally rational hierarchical logics to organization as an aim in itself, issue of organization of academic mode of production. Okay. It is very important to understand this. Okay. When there is a political shift from instrumentally rational hierarchical logics to organization as aim in itself, okay, therein lies the significance of the issues of organization of academic mode of production. I am just using this term because Marx always used the term mode of production, okay. But academic mode of production, in fact, Stanley used it for the first time, okay. That there is a hierarchy even within academia, okay. There is also power structure even within academia, okay, and so on, okay. Because the kind of knowledge that we produce, the kind of knowledge that we generate, okay, is also not universal. Okay. We must doubt what kind of knowledge we have produced or what kind of relevant knowledge that we have certified. We must interrogate that, we must question that. Okay. If if knowledge was universal, could be articulated and could be reduced or deduced from general principles, anyone could speak for anyone else, but it does not work in practice. That is why knowledge is relative, knowledge is not universal. Our rationality also is relative, it is not universal. Our reflexivity also is not absolute, it is also relative, it is also partial. That is why what I experience may differ from your experience, and your experience may differ from her experience may differ from his experience may differ from the entire societal experience. Our experiences are pretty unique to our own existence, our own practices, our own structures, and the way we try to cope with certain situations. Okay. What then we have discussed in this lecture? We have discussed the feminist challenge to critical modernist paradigm in sociology in terms of social movements, reflexivity and rationality. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss the feminist challenge to critical modernist paradigm in sociology in terms of holism or totality. Thank you.